The story of the Omen didn't end with a child staring into the camera, it was only the beginning. Damien Thorn is growing up, and with age comes power, influence, and a much higher body count. As a teenager, he begins to embrace his destiny, slowly bending the world to his will. And as an adult, he no longer hides, he stands at the height of his power, ready to claim his kingdom. But no reign lasts forever, and even the devil's chosen one isn't untouchable. This is the rise and fall of Damien Thorn. After the massive success of The Omen in 1976, a sequel was inevitable. The original film had raked in over $60 million at the box office, an enormous sum for a horror film at the time, and left audiences haunted by its chilling implications.
Damien, Omen II.
Arrived in 1978, aiming to continue the Antichrist's rise to power, but this time with a new director and a shift in tone. The first movie was, of course, directed by Richard Donner, who went on to make Superman and didn't return for the sequel. Instead, Omen II was helmed by Don Taylor, a veteran of 70s sci-fi and horror, best known for Escape from the Planet of the Apes and the 1977 version of The Island of Dr. Moreau. Taylor wasn't actually the first choice though. The British director Mike Hodges, who later made Flash Gordon, was originally hired and even shot several scenes before being replaced due to creative differences. Reportedly, producer Harvey Benhard was frustrated with his slow progress and in one heated argument even pulled a gun. Some of his footage remains in the final cut, including the awesome opening scene in Jerusalem, but for the most part the film reflects Taylor's vision. Still, Hodges retained the screenwriting credits. The only returning cast member was Leo McKern as Carl Bugenhagen, the sole survivor of the first film's good guys. Damien's new foster parents were played by two Academy Award winners, William Holden, who had actually turned down the role of Robert Thorne in the original, and Lee Grant as his wife, Anne. Holden had reportedly been reluctant to star a film about the devil, but after seeing The Omen's success, he reconsidered. Meanwhile, one of my all-time favorites, Lance Henriksen, appears as Sergeant Neff, an enigmatic military figure subtly guiding Damien's destiny. His role was originally more significant, but Taylor's rewrites reduced his screen time considerably. As for the Antichrist himself, Jonathan Scott Taylor was cast as Damian. Having only done minor roles before, he might have seemed like an unexpected choice, but he looked the part and took on a far more central role than the young Damian of the original. Jerry Goldsmith returned to compose the score, and the soundtrack takes a different direction to match the film's altered tone. With a budget of $6 million, more than double the original's $2.8 million, the film had greater flexibility, which shows in its grander sets and more elaborate death scenes. While Richard Donner had made every dollar count in The Omen, here there was more room to maneuver. Filming took place mostly in Chicago and Wisconsin, with the opening scene shot in Israel. Damien, Omen II was released not on June 6 but on June 9, 1978. As with most movies I like to dig into, the reception was mixed. While its lighter tone and more entertainment-driven approach were praised, it was criticized for lacking the frights and suspense that defined the original. But despite that, it was a box office success, earning 4 times its budget. Seven years after The Omen, Damien Thorn is now a teenager, living with his wealthy uncle Richard Thorn. For the most part, Damien seems like a normal kid. He has friends, plays sports, and isn't orchestrating mysterious accidents. Yet. But as those around him begin to suspect the truth, his protectors placed in key positions make sure nothing derails his path. Anyone who gets too close to the truth ends up dead in some ridiculously over-the-top fashion. A doctor examining Damien's blood finds something abnormal, sliced in half. A reporter digging too deep, eyes gouged out. His stepbrother isn't playing ball, an unexpected aneurysm. Richard's old friend uncovers a disturbing truth, an unfortunate train accident. As Damien slowly realizes he is the Antichrist, he wrestles with the revelation before ultimately embracing his destiny. Meanwhile, Richard investigates the warnings about his nephew, but before he can act, Damien ensures those standing in his way, including his own family, are eliminated. By the film's end, Damian secures his place as the heir of Thorn Industries, fully stepping into the role he was born to play. What makes Omen II interesting is how it shifts from the gloomy, slow-burn horror of the first film to a more action-driven thriller. It trades the eerie psychological tension of the Omen for bigger, bloodier death scenes and a broader scope. Damian is no longer just a threat to his immediate family, he is now being groomed for power on a global scale, with Thorn Industries as his launching pad. The corporate intrigue adds an interesting element, and the movie does a good job at being the conduit between the original and the third film, making the transition into Omen 3 feel relatively seamless. I think I actually like this movie more than the average viewer might. It's less scary, sure, but a more soothing watch. The filmmakers were clearly working off the Final Destination rulebook long before Final Destination existed. Half the fun is seeing how fate will take out its next victim. While the deaths are brutal and sometimes over the top, there are also more subtle moments like the quiet eerie demises of Damian's aunt and stepbrother. The acting holds up well, with the big-name cast delivering as expected. The supporting characters like Robert Foxworth's Ball Bureau and Lance Henriksen's Sergeant Neff stand out, though I wish Henriksen had played a bigger role in Damian's transformation. Jonathan Scott Taylor does a solid job as Damian, but the movie never quite lets him go fully unhinged. His identity crisis moment, where he first realizes the truth about himself, is one of the most intriguing parts of the movie, but the story quickly moves on, leaving all that potential unexplored. Early drafts even included a love interest subplot, which was ultimately cut. I love growth stories, and this film had so much unused potential in that regard. For a brief moment he seems genuinely shaken by the revelation of who he is, almost as if he has a choice. But the film never really explores that internal struggle. His protectors step in, guiding him down the inevitable path, and soon enough he is in full beast mode. The ending scene, however, is perfect. Damian's imperious look, gleaming with that regal arrogance as he walks out of the museum, perfectly encapsulates his triumphant transformation. Goldsmith's score still impresses, while not as iconic as Ave Satani, it matches the film's tone perfectly. Overall, Damien Omen II ups the scale and the body count, but loses much of the eerie dread that made the original a classic. Still, it's an engaging story, it has some great moments, and it offers a compelling glimpse of Damien's evolution. And honestly, it resonates more with me when I'm not directly comparing it to the original classic. By 1981, the Omen franchise had reached its natural conclusion. Damian had risen to power, and now it was time to see what he would do with it. The first two films followed his childhood and adolescence, but the final conflict would depict the Antichrist as a grown-ass man, standing at the height of his political influence, preparing for the ultimate battle against the returning Christ. Like Omen II, this film went through several rewrites during production. Early drafts lean into a darker, apocalyptic scale where Damien's reign would trigger global chaos and destruction. However, budget constraints forced the story to become smaller and more intimate, focusing less on large-scale events and more on Damien's personal struggle to maintain control. While this shift allows for a deeper character study, it also reduces the grand sense of impending doom that had been building across the trilogy. Unlike the first two films, which featured Hollywood heavyweights like Gregory Peck and William Holden, the final conflict took on a different approach, casting Sam Neill in his first major role as adult Damien Thorn. Neill was still relatively unknown at the time, having mostly worked in Australian and British films, but his performance as Damien, calm, composed and chillingly charismatic, is one of the film's strongest elements. Today, Neill is best known for Jurassic Park and Event Horizon, but even back then he had a presence that made him feel born to play the Antichrist. The supporting cast included Rossano Brazzi as De Carlo, the leader of the priests seeking to assassinate Damien, and Don Gordon as Harvey Dean, Damien's political fixer, a man who serves the Antichrist for personal gain but begins to crack as Damien's demands escalate. Lisa Harrow was cast as journalist Kate Reynolds, the film's attempt at giving Damien a more human connection. Kate serves as the audience surrogate, slowly unraveling the truth behind Damien's power. Meanwhile, Barnaby Holm plays her son Peter, who falls under Damian's influence in a subplot that never quite gets the payoff it deserves. Directing duties went to Graham Baker, a first-time feature director who had previously worked in commercials and television. The script was penned by Andrew Birkin, who later took on the Herculean task of adapting The Name of the Rose to the big screen. Compared to its predecessors, the film leaned less into horror and more into political thriller territory, focusing on prophecies, assassinations, and power struggles rather than eerie supernatural forces. Despite this shift, Jerry Goldsmith returned once more to compose the soundtrack. With a budget of $5 to $6 million, the final conflict had the same resources as Omen II, but the money was spent on cold dramatic cinematography and UK locations including Yorkshire, Cornwall, and London. However, the biggest production challenge was the ending, originally envisioned as a far more apocalyptic spectacle, but ultimately cut down due to budget constraints, resulting in a rushed and anticlimactic finale. Omen III: The Final Conflict was released on March 20th, 1981, and as expected, reactions were, well, let's just say they weren't great. If Omen II had mixed reviews, The Final Conflict got a decidedly colder reception. Marketing for the film leaned heavily into the idea of a climactic battle between good and evil, but the audiences expecting a showdown of biblical proportions were left with something far more subdued. While Sam Neill's performance was sometimes praised and sometimes panned, the film's lack of traditional horror elements and its abrupt conclusion left many feeling underwhelmed. Still, it was a modest success, earning around $20 million worldwide. A sequel titled Omen IV: Armageddon was even considered but never materialized. Omen IV did eventually happen, just not in the way anyone hoped, but that's a story for another video. Years have passed since Damien Thorn took control of Thorn Industries, and now as a full-grown man he stands at the height of power. Appointed as the US ambassador to Great Britain, the same position his adoptive father once held, Damian is no longer just a manipulated pawn of fate. He is the Antichrist in full command of his influence, orchestrating events on a global scale. But while his power seems untouchable, he knows there's one force that can stop him, the second coming of Christ, which is prophesied to happen soon. Determined to prevent his divine adversary from rising, Damian initiates one of the film's darkest storylines, ordering the mass murder of all newborn boys in England, just in case one of them is the Messiah.
Do you hear me?
It's a disturbing sequence, although very subtly portrayed, and while most of the Omen franchise deals in elaborate accidents, this is pure, calculated evil in industrial scale, making Damian the most actively villainous we've ever seen him. Meanwhile, a group of monks armed with the daggers of Megiddo is plotting his assassination, setting the stage for a final battle. This should have been an unstoppable setup, the Antichrist at peak power trying to stamp out any chance of divine opposition while dodging assassins from the monastery. But this is where the movie starts breaking its own rules. If you remember the first movie, the daggers of Megiddo were said to be the only weapons capable of killing the Antichrist, and all 7 had to be used together to destroy him. But here, suddenly one dagger is enough. This completely contradicts the mythology built up in the first film, and it cheapens Damian's eventual downfall. Then there's Damian's bizarre habit of personally hunting down the priests. This man is the most powerful figure in the world. He has an army of followers, corporate power, political influence, and limitless resources, not to mention the infernal overlord extraordinaire as a daddy-o. Why is he sneaking around in dark corridors doing the job himself when he could have sent a hit squad? It makes for some entertaining moments, sure, but logically it doesn't fit the character. Maybe it was a sign of his arrogance and overconfidence. What's the fun of being the Antichrist if you can't use your superpowers in person? And then there's the ending, easily my biggest gripe with the film. After 2.5 movies of build-up, this is how Damien Thorn goes out. There's no real fight, no clever reversal, no moment of realization, just an abrupt, unsatisfying resolution what should have been a climactic battle of good and evil. And I was not expecting a mortal combat between Jesus and Damian, and I recognized how challenging scripting a fulfilling final scene must have been. Still, I really dislike this ending. The final conflict ends not with a bang but with a whimper. All that being said, I still enjoy this movie a lot more than the critics did. For one, Sam Neill is fantastic. I don't care what anyone says, whatever role he plays, I love him.
My friends call me Bond. James Bond.
His Damian is charming, intelligent and dangerously self-assured, making it completely believable that the world would fall under his influence. He also seems to manifest a lot of human characteristics and even a cruel sense of humor.
And he shall come forth out of the Angel Isle. That's what the prophecy says. And if there's one thing these pedantic Christians believe in, it's sticking to the letter of their prophecies.
Oh, you left him hanging there. That's just evil. At its best moments, the final conflict leans into Damian as a fully realized villain, something the first two films only hinted at. If you focus on the character work and performances, there's a lot to appreciate, but if you're expecting a triumphant ending to the trilogy, it's hard not to feel let down. The final conflict had so much potential. This could have been a horror epic, a grand-scale showdown between the forces of good and evil. Instead, what we got was a smaller, quieter film that doesn't fully deliver on its setup. But despite all that, I still like it. Sam Neill owns every scene he's in, and the film does an excellent job portraying Damian as a true world-threatening force. It might not be the explosive finale it should have been, but it's still a fascinating and unique take on the Antichrist mythos. Next time, we'll explore what happened after Damian, a TV movie sequel nobody really asked for, a 2006 remake nobody really asked for, and a brand new prequel attempting to uncover the origins of the Antichrist's arrival. Do like and do all the other things everybody always tells you to do, and I will be back with some more Omens soon enough.
Stay tuned.